Welcome. We are here today with political cartoonist Jesse Springer. And first things first, I'd like to thank the Friends of the Library. As always, their tireless support makes the breadth and diversity of library programming possible. And we're here today with Jesse Springer. He's going to share a slideshow of highlights from his new book, Only in Oregon. And he has been drawing and distributing Oregon-themed political cartoons to newspapers around the state since 1995.
And he has been
Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of an echo here.
Oregon-themed political cartoons to newspapers around the state. Only in Oregon. 1995. And he has been
I'm getting a little bit of an echo here.
Oregon-themed political cartoons to newspapers around the state. Only in Oregon.
Are you guys hearing that echo?
I'm hearing it, yeah.
Yeah.
Is it coming from me?
Let me see here. Oh, I think that helped it.
Is that better? Coming from me?
Let me see here. Oh, I think that helped it. Do you have the YouTube window open on your computer?
I don't, but
Do you have the YouTube window open on your computer? You know, you can't.
I'm just gonna quit.
You can't do something with technology without having.
I just quit it out. I mean, it was hidden, but let's try it again.
Oh, good. I think we solved the problem.
I'm sorry.
No, I think that if you solve all of your technical problems in the first 2 minutes of a broadcast, you're doing pretty well. It's when they sort of drag out throughout the whole thing. All right. Thanks for your patience, guys. So Jesse Springer, he's been drawing and distributing Oregon-themed political cartoons to newspapers around the state since 1995. He runs his graphic design business, Springer Design and Illustration, from his studio in Eugene, Oregon. And after the slideshow, we'll have time for some questions and answers. And you can submit your questions right in the YouTube chat. So I'm going to hand it over to Jesse.
Hey, thank you very much, Sarah. And thanks very much to the Eugene Public Library for hosting this event. I really appreciate that. And welcome, everybody. I'm glad you could make it. As Sarah said, we're going to have a little bit of a slideshow to begin with. And this is a slideshow that I put together that is both an overview of the cartoons in the book, but it's also in some ways a summary of the core issues that Oregon has dealt with over the last 26 years. So it's a fun way to review those issues, I guess. And you know, if just a little note, if you miss something in the slideshow as it's going on, we'll throw the link to the slideshow in the chat at the end, so you can go back, or if for some reason you want to watch it again, you'll be able to do that. So as we're going along, if you want to start putting a question in the chat, that's great. I will be around after the slideshow. It's about 20 plus minutes to answer all your questions about editorial cartooning that you were just afraid to ask, that you always wanted to know. And so I guess that's pretty much it. Yeah. So Sarah, if you want to start that slideshow, that'd be great. Welcome. My name is Jesse Springer, and I've been drawing Oregon-themed political cartoons since 1995. And now I've put together a greatest hits collection of my cartoons in a book called Only in Oregon. Oregon's different. We're weird and traditional, liberal and conservative, urban and rural. We're passionate and not afraid to speak our minds. It's all fertile ground for issues from the comical to the controversial, and everything in between. This collection of insightful, knee-slapping editorial cartoons tells a 26-year whimsical, illustrated story of Oregon's strange but true cultural and political history. Yep, Oregon is different. From the kicker to PERS, the timber wars to climate change, vote by mail to death with dignity, the Bundy Boys to the Proud Boys. All of this could have happened only in Oregon. Let's take a look at some highlights, shall we? But before we dive into politics, let's ease into this. What's the first thing that we talk about to avoid getting into something controversial? The weather. Now, Oregon is famous for a certain kind of weather, rain. And we get lots of it. But as much as we like to complain about it, deep down we Oregonians really love our rain. Which is why sometimes we've felt like this in recent years. But the drought cycle that we're in right now, it isn't really the weather exactly. It's actually a function of something else. Climate change. Summers are getting hotter and hotter. Causing catastrophic forest fires that choke us with smoke. Climate change is upon us right now in Oregon, although there are some who refuse to see it. Of course, intertwined with Oregon's environmental issues is Oregon's historic economic driver, the timber industry. Pictured on the cover of my new book is this cartoon, which captures Oregon's complicated relationship with trees. Through the middle part of the 20th century, Oregon's timber industry buzzed along unfettered. Trees were plentiful, and the money flowed to communities and timber companies alike. In the 90s, environmentalists and concerned foresters sought to set limits on unsustainable timber harvests by invoking the Endangered Species Act on behalf of the humble spotted owl. So began the timber wars of the modern era, with the spotted owl playing the role of villain in the eyes of the timber industry. Timber harvests declined dramatically, sending shockwaves through rural communities across the state. But there were other factors at play besides habitat conservation for the spotted owl. Industry modernization and raw log exports, for example, caused many timber workers to lose their jobs. And, during the Great Recession, plummeting demand for timber products took a heavy toll. Oregon's representatives to Congress had secured annual federal payments to rural counties in exchange for lost timber revenues. But during that same period of the Great Recession, Congress cut back on and ultimately eliminated those payments. The result was a triple whammy for Oregon's rural communities that had previously relied on the timber industry. Their workers lost their jobs, those communities stopped receiving revenues for timber harvests, and they eventually lost the federal compensation money as well. Ever since, the timber industry and environmental groups in Oregon have been waging a pitched legal and public relations battle over the fate of Oregon's trees. Now, another big issue that came to a head in the 2000s was gay marriage. Before gay marriage was legalized nationwide by the Supreme Court in 2015, many states, counties, and cities moved towards legalization of gay marriage and/or civil unions on their own. In 2004, Multnomah County made gay marriage legal. This led to much hand-wringing amongst religious conservatives who warned that gay marriage was a slippery slope towards even worse social ills. Later that year, an Oregon ballot measure passed by popular vote banning gay marriage. After that, some Oregon cities and counties, and eventually the state legislature, began making domestic partnerships or civil unions legal for same-sex couples. Moving along to another topic of tremendous importance to Oregonians: taxes and the economy. Oregon is only one of 5 states without a sales tax, and Oregonians in general are notorious for resisting taxes. One recent example of this was in 2016 when the legislature introduced Measure 97, a gross receipts tax designed to raise money for public education. The measure failed. This tax resistance has made it a challenge for state legislators to devise budgets to pay for services, especially during tough economic times, of which there have been plenty over the past 26 years. The worst of these times were the years following the Great Recession in the late 2000s. Intertwined with the economy and state budget is something that is entirely unique to Oregon: the kicker. The kicker is the name for a one-of-a-kind law enshrined in the Oregon Constitution that forces the state to refund to taxpayers all revenues that exceed the state economist's revenue projection if actual revenues exceed that projection by 2% or more. Although tremendously popular, it prevents the state from building up reserves in anticipation of tough economic times, of which there have been many, as I said. Because of the kicker and the lack of the sales tax, budget shortfalls have been commonplace during recessions. Yet the Oregon legislature is loath to touch it. One last big piece to Oregon's economic/budgetary picture is yet another political lightning rod: PERS, the Public Employee Retirement System. Back in the 70s and 80s, when the timber money kept Oregon's economy flush, PERS managers made some very generous contractual guaranteed returns for public employees. As Oregon's economy began to hit bumps and budgets tightened, the legislature sought to rein in those generous benefits. The vast majority of attempts to limit PERS have been overturned by the Oregon Supreme Court, however. Their rulings are firm. The state cannot go back on its contractual obligations, no matter how unrealistic they may be. All of these economic factors, coupled with some major property tax limitation ballot measures from the 1990s, have had a huge negative impact on Oregon's public education. The first sign of trouble was the ballooning of class sizes. Unfortunately, the situation just got worse and worse. Not only did classrooms become ever more crowded, but school districts began lopping days off the school calendar to make ends meet. Luckily, Oregon has a group of people who can solve all of our problems. A group we can depend upon to work together to improve the lives of all Oregonians. Yes, that group of people I'm talking about is the Oregon legislature. Okay, that was just a little bit of sarcasm, but during the 1990s, Republicans were largely in control of the Oregon legislature. But around the turn of the millennium, that balance began to shift. The result was an enormous amount of partisan gridlock.
Shortly thereafter, the Democrats came to be in control, and that presented its own problems. A few years later, the Oregon legislature decided to meet every year instead of once every 2 years. Incidentally, a boon to Oregon political cartoonists everywhere. One person who presided over a record number of these legislative sessions was Oregon's longest-serving governor, John Kitzhaber. After having been elected to 2 terms in the 1990s, Kitzhaber returned to win 2 more elections in 2010 and 2014. Unfortunately for Kitzhaber, the wheels began to fall off in 2013 with the debacle of the failed Cover Oregon insurance exchange. He managed to win re-election, however, in 2014, despite Cover Oregon, rumblings of corruption within his administration, and his support of PERS reforms, which angered his traditional political base. Ultimately, Kitzhaber was forced to resign shortly after the start of his 4th term in early 2015, when details of corruption and conflicts of interest swirled around him and his First Lady, Sylvia Hayes. Shortly thereafter, a different family rode into the state, causing a very different kind of trouble: the Bundys. Ammon and Ryan Bundy led a group of armed land-use protesters in a takeover of the remote Malheur Wildlife Refuge in eastern Oregon. The Bundys believed that the U.S. Constitution gave them the right to do exactly as they pleased on public lands. Regardless of the impact they might have on others. Speaking of which, Oregon is famous for its demonstration of all kinds. Protests. The late 90s saw a multitude of anarchists in the streets, protesting capitalism in its various forms. More recently, Portland in particular has become a battleground for clashes between alt-right groups like the Proud Boys and Antifa. As well as ordinary folks looking for social justice. In an eerie precursor to the January 6, 2021 riot at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., alt-right protesters broke into the Oregon Capitol building on December 20th, 2020, seeking to use violence to stop the lawful political process going on inside. Moving on to something only slightly less divisive is a topic Oregonians are very passionate about: sports. Although it is no longer called the Civil War, the rivalry between the University of Oregon Ducks and the Oregon State Beavers is no less intense. On the football field, the Ducks have had the upper hand in modern times, winning the Rose Bowl in 2012, and in 2020. Both against the Wisconsin Badgers. Both the Beavers and the Ducks have had tremendous success with their women's basketball programs. In 2019, the U of O team, led by Sabrina Ionesco, was on the verge of a national championship run before the NCAA tournament was canceled by COVID. Earlier that year, they beat the U.S. Olympic team. Another topic with a long history in the state of Oregon has been marijuana. Back in the day, marijuana was not legal, but illegal growers had long taken advantage of the perfect climate for growing the stuff. Medical marijuana was made legal in the state in 1998, and then in 2015 it was legalized for recreational users. Although recreational marijuana has been made legal by state law, it is still against federal law. Coming up closer to the present day, Oregon, like every other state, has had to deal with COVID-19. In the beginning, the main symptoms were odd hoarding behaviors. Then came the unprecedented lockdown of the spring of 2020, which presented its own challenges and silver linings. As the year dragged on, cases mounted, and that winter saw a staggering number of fatalities. As vaccines became widely available in the spring of 2021, cases began to drop again, and optimism ran high. Along with COVID, 2020 saw an event that would cause everybody to stop and re-examine just what is going on in our country. A racial reckoning. At the same time as the lockdowns of the spring of 2020, the world learned of the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police. For many white folks, that led to an examination of just what it means to be white or black in the United States. For many self-identified liberals and progressives, and yes, I'm talking about myself here, that introspection revealed painful truths about unconscious bias. That brings us up just about to the present. But before I end, I'd like to present a few cartoons that don't really fall neatly into any particular category. I call this group Miscellaneous. One day in 2009, it was unseasonably warm at the Oregon coast, and aquatic life was mysteriously washing up onto the shore. And of course, we all know that vote by mail was pioneered by the state of Oregon. Wolves in Oregon are a contentious issue. Some people love them, some people hate them. One wolf, dubbed OR7, captured the imagination of just about everybody, possibly because he left the state, by traveling over 1,000 miles into California in search of a mate. He eventually found his perfect match and sired a total of 7 pups over his lifetime. This cartoon ran on Father's Day 2014. Last but not least, let us celebrate the fact that in 2017, the Oregon legislature made it legal to harvest and eat roadkill. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like these cartoons, check in the comments below to find out how you can order a book and also how you can get cartoons delivered to your email inbox. Cheers.
Wow, I actually learned some new things about Oregon history in that slideshow, and I've been a lifelong Oregonian, so
Yeah,
it's like a history lesson.
it is. It's a fun history lesson. That's what a lot of people have said about my book.
Yeah. Well, we have several questions here.
My family's been very busy.
So Lavinia asks, can you talk about the relevance of cartooning in an era of consolidation in the newspaper industry and declining newspaper readership? Is there a role for cartooning in the online space?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, Lavinia. Yeah, and declining newspaper readership is the term that you use, and I would change that a little bit to declining newspaper subscribership. So basically, fewer and fewer people are paying for the news. A lot of people are still consuming it; they're just not paying for it. And so the model used to be in newspapers. Many newspapers, hundreds of newspapers, would have an employed full-time editorial cartoonist. And when the internet kind of broke newspapers and took away their revenue, everything contracted. And so now there's, 30, maybe 20 full-time editorial cartoonists around the country. So it's had a tremendous impact, and just my own personal trajectory, I kind of no longer had a dream of becoming one of those full-time employed editorial cartoonists. And that's when I decided to sort of be more of a part-time regional editorial cartoonist, focusing strictly on Oregon issues. So that was how that impacted me. Is there a role for cartooning in the online space? I think there is. It's just not a paid role, and that's sort of the conundrum that so many creators are facing today. Is that it's very easy to get your work out there in front of eyeballs, but it's very difficult to get paid for it.
Yeah. And then also, how do you come up with your ideas for cartoons?
Well, it's a kind of a long process. It takes me a while to come up with a way to address an issue. But I guess to step back, the first thing is I will research the issues of the day and pick a topic that really resonates with me. And that's very important because I feel like I have to have some emotion around an issue to really come up with a good cartoon. Once I've found that topic, I'll make a concise statement about what it is that I want to say. What's the political statement that I want to make? And then from there, there's some various comic devices that are pretty common with editorial cartooning. There's hyperbole, there's irony, there's incongruous juxtaposition, misdirection. There's just a kind of a few tricks, and I just turn it around in my head and just try to come up with which angle is gonna work the best for me to convey this idea that I have with a little twist of humor. So it's really a hard process to totally nail down, but I'm just trying to give you a little bit of a sense of it.
And one thing I had wondered, which is I think somewhat related to this question, is when you're choosing topics for cartoons, do you try to avoid like a partisan political viewpoint, or do you incorporate your political viewpoint into the cartoons? How do you sort of tread that line?
Yeah, well, I think I definitely put a political opinion into the cartoon, and I think that's in some ways the purpose of it. It's like a written opinion column, except it's in a cartoon form. So I definitely will try to do that, although not 100% of the time, right? Because some of the cartoons that we looked at, there wasn't necessarily a political viewpoint being put across. So there is kind of a continuum, I guess, between really stating a strong political view and not stating a strong political view. And so it can rest somewhere all along those points. For example, I was just talking about the Ducks and the Beavers. I mean, it's not really just the conflict between them and just trying to make a fun joke about that. So that's a good example of one that I'm not putting forth a political opinion. But I would say in general, most of the time, if it's an issue, then I am trying to make a statement.
Yeah. All right. And another question we have is, how relevant are your Oregon-based cartoons to issues at the national level?
Well, that's a good question, because I only live here. I don't live elsewhere. But my feeling is that a lot of the issues that I've addressed over the years in Oregon also translate to communities around the country. For example, in education, I think that we've had a historic disinvestment in education in Oregon. That may not be the case everywhere, but I'm guessing that in a lot of places that's happening. So that's a possibility. I've also talked about, money in politics. That's an issue. Certainly when some of my more recent cartoons about COVID, the racial reckoning of 2020, so there are definitely a lot of issues that are occurring in Oregon and places all around the country, and they're certainly transportable to those other places, I would imagine.
Yeah. And Margaret wants to know, would you consider making posters of your cartoons available for sale on your website? They can think of several that they wouldn't mind having.
Well, I certainly would consider that if there was a strong demand. But Margaret, you can DM me afterwards and we can arrange that.
All right. And I think I'm saying this right. Trina said that this was a very entertaining intro to recent Oregon issues. Thank you. And the question is, when did you switch from black and white to color?
Yeah. So I had to look that up. I saw that question in the chat, so I'm prepared. It was 2009. And it was interesting because when I first started drawing editorial cartoons in 1995, it was strictly black and white on black and white newsprint. And then when it became clear, there were two things that happened. One is there was actually becoming more color printing in newspapers for a little while there. And then the other thing, obviously, is having the cartoons be on the newspaper's websites. And so I guess around 2009, I realized that it was important for me to be able to provide my cartoons in color for my clients, my newspaper clients, so that they could either print them in color or have them in color on their websites. And it actually also is a little more fun. It allows me to do a little more with the artwork to have it be in color. But every time that I would do a color cartoon, I would also make a grayscale version of it because most of my clients are still printing in black and white in their newspapers. So, yeah.
Yeah. And then Daniel has a question. They really love your cartoons, and similar to Sarah's question about putting your politics into your cartoons, can you share some feedback that you've received on your cartoons?
Hey, Daniel, it's really great to hear from you. Feedback. I have gotten some feedback. It's amazing to me how little feedback I've actually gotten over the years. I've occasionally gotten some letters, gotten a few emails, and when I guess I'm talking about negative feedback, I will have people that I know or that I'm introduced to who find out that this is what I do. They say, "Oh, I love your cartoons," and that's kind of a basic thing. But I will get some people who really disagree with me about my cartoons, and actually, I really love it when that happens because to me, it's a sign that people are reading them and they're getting engaged, and that my cartoon kind of struck a chord, I guess. And I'm not trying to necessarily poke people in the eye. I just want to actually start a discussion. And so I've had some really, I would say, fruitful interchanges with people over email when it comes to this, and we've actually had a dialogue about some of these issues that I've really appreciated. And I think that when both sides of people engaging in a dialogue kind of come to it with somewhat of an open mind and willingness to entertain other people's positions, I think that there can be some common ground that can be found. So that's been a fun little side bit to that.
Yeah. And then Trina is wanting to know, do you audition your cartoons with family and friends to see how they go over? And what about when you're on deadline and can't think of a funny idea? Can you reuse old concepts or themes in a pinch?
Trina, thanks. Those are really good questions. I don't typically audition my cartoon ideas, although I have on occasion, usually with my daughter. I think that she is very wise and knows a lot of stuff. And also, especially if I'm trying to tread on in areas that I'm, whatever, okay, boomer. I'm not, I'm an Xer, but, I'm a little too old for. I definitely seek her guidance on some of those things, but typically I don't. What about when I'm on a deadline and can't think of a funny idea? Yeah, that happens pretty much every time I sit down to draw a cartoon. So the deadline is a really important motivator for me. It's what sort of drives me to say, okay, I got to come up with something now. I got to figure something out. So there is something about that kind of little anxious feeling about the deadline that is part of having an idea pop into your head, I guess. And about reusing old concepts and themes, I have tried not to reuse old concepts and themes. I don't really believe anyone's really looking over my shoulder and ever going to say, hey, we've seen that one before. But I do try to come up with novel ideas every time. I will say that sometimes I've come pretty close to a similar concept, and it's sometimes when you don't have that idea, then you have to go back to the well and just twist it a little bit so that it fits the particular week. Yeah, that's a good question.
All right. Yeah, sometimes those deadlines really help with the inspiration.
They're both good and bad. What I've often said for what I do is that I need an audience and a deadline. Those are the two things that I really need to do the political cartooning. I would never have been as productive over the years as if I hadn't had that weekly deadline. I've drawn almost 1,000 cartoons over that period of time, and it's really it's been very helpful for me to have that.
Yeah. And one thing I kind of wonder, are there any political cartoonists that you're sort of a fan of that you always read and pay attention to?
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure if there's any necessarily that are still going that I'm super fan of, but a couple of names from the past are Jeff McNelly, Jack Omen, who used to be at the Oregonian and wrote a foreword to this book. I'm a big fan of. Another guy named Tom Tolles, I think he just recently retired. He was at the Washington Post. He was also a big favorite of mine. And what I loved about him is his drawings were so simple and his ideas were genius. And it was almost like a stand-up comic delivering a joke in a very deadpan manner, just with this great idea and this very simple drawing. And, that actually just leads me to one other thing that I might say is that a political cartoon, I would say, is mostly writing. Maybe 70, 80, maybe even 90% of it. And the drawing is really just there in support of the idea. If you have a bad idea that's drawn beautifully, it's still a bad idea. So the key part of it is to have a good idea, and the drawing just needs to support it. So you don't need to be this exquisite artist to necessarily be a political cartoonist.
Yeah, you have to kind of distill the idea in a graphic format.
Yeah.
Let's see. Trina
Trina
asks, you talked about some tricks of the trade. How did you actually learn the art and craft of cartooning?
Well, it's been a while. Let's see. A lot of it's through observation, and you just talked about, some of the editorial cartoonists that I've admired and watched over the years. So I kind of look at what they do, and both in terms of their art and in terms of kind of how they frame an issue, how they put together a concept. So there's some observation. I did I got some books way back in the day. I have a book called The Comic Toolbox that has a lot of lists and describes and gives examples of some of the things that I mentioned with hyperbole and irony and juxtaposition and some of those things. So part of it's observation, part of it's, sort of studying some book learning, and honestly, a lot of it is just experience. How over the years I've gotten, I would say, more practiced at doing it, and so it comes a little bit more naturally. And at some point, I did get to the point where I was confident when I started working on a cartoon in the morning that by 3 o'clock in the afternoon I would have something. Like in the early days, I was always afraid that I wasn't going to come up with something, but as time went on, I did become more confident. So a lot of that is experience. So yeah, self-taught pretty much.
Though I did write down the name of that book because I want to see if the
Comic
library has
Toolbox.
it.
Yeah, it's a good book. It was recommended to me by Jan Elliott, who's also a well-known Eugene persona and a great person and a friend.
Great. Margaret is wondering when you started cartooning in general.
Well, she ought to know. Let's see. So probably when I was a kid, just drawing funny pictures for my friends, and my friends would draw funny pictures, and that started, went through, school notebooks and high school and college, and but I really didn't refine it, and kind of getting back to some of these techniques and stuff. A lot of my early cartoons were strictly for a small select audience that would sort of get an in-joke maybe. And so in order to create a cartoon that is ready for more general consumption, I think I did have to develop a level of sophistication and understanding of how that works. So that was, so I started drawing the editorial cartoons right around the beginning of 1995. And it was then that I really started to study that and how does that really work?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Daniel is wondering, can you talk about how you stay connected to and informed about the Eugene community to inspire your cartoons?
Yeah. Well, so and just to sort of clarify, I in my early days, when I first started in 1995, I was just doing Eugene cartoons, and then around 2003, I started to have it be more broadly Oregon. But to speak to the question, I just read the local paper. I read the Eugene Register Guard. I still get the paper. I talk to a lot of people, and they say that they don't get it anymore. So that's one way that I keep in touch. And then as far as the Oregon issues, I will go online and read articles from the Oregonian and OPB, the NPR station, and so forth. So that's, I would say, the main way in which I keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening around. And I, certainly talk to people and engage what their interest level is or their knowledge of something. That's one thing that I have to keep in mind is the knowledge level of my audience, because if I'm talking about an issue that's kind of complicated, is it something that my audience is going to know about? Is it, like COVID, where everyone sort of knows about it? Or is it like PERS, the Public Employee Retirement System, where it's a little arcane and not everyone knows the ins and outs? And so depending on that, I may have to put some exposition into the cartoon itself to give a little information. But I would say just reading the local news is the main way that I stay informed.
And the second part of that question is, have you ever had a cartoon used by people who are working on an issue that you wrote about?
Yeah, I occasionally will get emails from people who are involved with an issue that saw my cartoon and they want to use the cartoon in some sort of publication that they're doing, some kind of newsletter or website or a book or something like that. So occasionally I have. I've also had some funny situations where I was criticizing, I believe, the leadership of the local hospital, Peace Health, way back in the day. And I had the guy who was the main PR person who I was kind of criticizing asked me for a copy of the cartoon, and he had it framed. So that was And I also had a state senator in Oregon who was I did a cartoon that has the state capitol, and it has a hashtag Me Too written all over it. It was during a time when there was, some revelations about a lot of sexual misconduct that was going on in the Oregon Capitol, and she also ended up with a cartoon of mine that hangs in her office. So I do appreciate it when people who are directly connected to the issues, find my cartoons and enjoy them and value them. Yeah, that's pretty rewarding.
Yeah. Julie is wondering where they can get your book.
So I think you put the link in the chat. Did you not? I think you did.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, it's a good question, because it's not available in bookstores, although one exception, Tsunami Books, it is available there. Otherwise, it's available just on my website, and that's in the link in the chat that you posted, springerdesign.biz/books.
Yeah. I can imagine, having started in 1995 and focusing on Eugene, that you've really seen the city change a great deal over that period of time, and I can imagine that the types of topics and the character that the character of the city has kind of changed.
It has changed a lot, in sort of, I would also argue that, like the politics at the state level, I would say Eugene has also turned a little bit from kind of leaning a little bit to the right of center to leaning a little bit to the left of center in terms of, the mayor and some of the composition of the city council, and also the Lane County commissioners. So that's definitely happened. Certainly all the development, I mentioned Peace Health, that was a huge thing in Eugene back when they would just have the university campus at Sacred Heart Medical Center, and they were looking to expand. It was a huge controversy about they were going to have to cut down all these trees to expand downtown, and then they were just like, forget it, we're going out to this other place. And then that threw everyone into a conniption fit because they was going to Springfield. So anyway, there's a lot of there have been a lot of changes and a lot of development, I would say. And we're going to see even more with, I believe it's HB 2021 that's right now in front of the city council in terms of the rezoning and the kind of getting rid of what's been known as single family zoning. So that's going to have a huge impact on Eugene in the coming years.
Definitely. Let's see. Anne says, someone once gave me a calendar put out by the Union of Concerned Scientists, and there you were on the cover. Was that a contest?
So my relationship with the Union of Concerned Scientists goes back to 2007 when I entered a contest called the Science Idol contest. It was around the time where American Idol was a new thing, the TV show. So that's they called their contest Science Idol, and so they were looking for cartoons on the topic of interference, political interference with science. And so I entered the cartoon, and the grand prize was actually to go have lunch with this guy Tom Tolles, who was and still is one of my editorial cartooning heroes, and he was at the Washington Post at the time. And funny story about that is that I entered, I think, maybe half a dozen cartoons, and I was of the 10 finalists, 3 of my cartoons were in the 10 finalists. And so I did this whole thing about letting everyone know, like, just vote for cartoon A, because I didn't want, my supporters to split the vote and all that stuff. So I said, vote for cartoon A. Well, in the end, cartoon C ended up winning the grand prize. So it just goes to show you how strong my social network is. But anyway, so I won a contest. I did go to DC. I met Tom Tolles. It was a wonderful experience. And since then, I have contributed cartoons. They do an annual calendar, and I have contributed cartoons to that calendar many years since then. So that's a great relationship I have with them.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. Well, I really want to thank everyone for all these great questions, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here, Jesse, and for the presentation. And oh, we got one more. Let's see. Is there one topic or issue that you like to focus on more than others, although you have your pulse on so many issues?
Yeah, well, that's another great question. There are a lot of, I will say there are a lot of issues that keep coming back, like the kicker and like PERS and so forth. I find it more and more challenging to come up with new ways to talk about them. But I would say, Dylan, the things that I like to draw cartoons on the most are the ones that, I feel the most passionate about. That's one thing. Also, I like cartoons that do have more of a national implication, whether it's an issue that is affecting everybody, like COVID, or whether it's a story that everybody is hearing about nationally, like, for example, when the Bundys took over the Malheur Wildlife Refuge. So those are ones, that I have particular interest in, but really when it comes down to it, do I feel passionate about it? Those are the ones that I really want to draw about. That's really what motivates me to draw political cartoons, is that passion.
Yeah, you need passion and a deadline, and you're all set.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, yes, thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks to everyone in the audience. And I hope and this video will stay up. If you missed any part of it, you can head back later and take a look. So
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
have a great afternoon, everyone.
Bye.